Welcome to Real American Ghosts, the place where your nightmares become reality. Sit back and turn out the lights and listen to some real ghost encounters. And remember, don't look behind you.
We learn about history to study the past, but for most of us, we forget that the past was once someone's reality. And in some cases, that reality was filled with pain, agony, and terror. So much so that time itself can't forget what happened. It claws and scratches at the veil that separates our world from the world beyond. And sometimes, that veil is broken, and the past comes back to live again. Hello, my name is Stan, and I am from Dearborn, Michigan. I have a crazy encounter that happened to me in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, 4 years ago. I have always had an interest in history, and a heavy interest in the American Civil War. So when I was asked by some friends to go to Gettysburg, I was ecstatic and couldn't wait to go there. The estimates vary, but it's been said that as many as 58,000 men died there, and the battle was a turning point for the Union. We arrived in Gettysburg and were staying for 3 days. This was in the fall of 2014. The first day I spent just walking and making a plan of where I wanted to go the next remaining 2 days. On the second day, we moved around Gettysburg, looking at different spots in town where different events took place and where medical stations were set up. The wounded from both sides were being taken to different locations in Gettysburg, and it became overwhelming for the people living there. It was getting dark when me and one of my friends headed out to the park. We still had a couple of hours before the park would close, and I wanted to see Little Round Top. I can still remember seeing the photos of the dead around Little Round Top, so when we got there, it really was a sad moment for the both of us. While standing there, an older couple had walked up, and we struck up a conversation with them. They were from Ohio, and both were retired, and for the summer, they had been traveling to different battlefields and winding up their trip in Gettysburg. The older guy was like me, interested in anything about the Civil War, and he had been to Antietam and Shiloh and a couple places I hadn't heard of. As we were talking, my friend said, "Hey, look at that." And I turned to look, and below us were 3 men dressed in Union uniforms, about 70 yards from us, walking across the field. I think it was called the Valley of Death. You could clearly see them in the distinctive blue uniforms. At first we thought they were part of some reenactment, but none of us had seen anything like that, and there would have been some kind of notice about it. The reenactments at Gettysburg are usually very large and happen mostly in July, around the time of the real battle. I'm sure there are probably others, but not at this time of the year. We watched the 3 guys walk side by side, and you could clearly see the rifles laid on their shoulders. My friend lifted his camera to get a picture of them when he said, "Where are they?" and looked over his camera. He was pointed straight at them, but you could not see them in the viewfinder. We all lifted our cameras, and it was the same. They were not visible in the viewfinder. I know a couple of us snapped pictures, but there was nothing there, and we could still see them walking across the field. Also down below us, there were some people walking on the path, and they saw them as well because they had stopped and pointed in that direction. My friend and I took off down and in that direction. As we made our way around, we lost sight of them, and when we could finally see that area, they were gone. My friend took off running towards the other people that were down the path, And when he reached them, he asked them if they had saw them, and they did. They said they saw them walking, and then they just vanished into thin air. The older couple had made their way down to us and said the same thing, that right after we went down, the three men vanished. One guy got a picture, but it looked like heat waves on a hot summer day when you look across the horizon. It was just blurry. I know without a doubt that we saw 3 ghosts of Union soldiers that day, and probably 10 people saw them too. As we were leaving, we saw a park ranger and told him. He smiled and said, "Yeah, a lot of people have seen and heard things here. I haven't been back to Gettysburg, but I would like to go again. Maybe next time I might see a Confederate ghost. You just never know." A spring day with 2 friends heading out to take summer jobs away from family and friends. Stories like that happen all over the world and eventually become stories people would tell their children one day. But not all are happy events. Sometimes they become twisted and terrifying and beyond belief. I grew up in Manitoba, Canada. My parents were immigrants who escaped Germany just before World War II, and they had some pretty incredible stories to share themselves, and they gave me this gift of growing up in Canada. We are grounded and rational people and are proud veterans of the armed forces and police forces. And I share this to say that the events of the night I am about to share, I still don't have answers for 24 years later. And I wish I did, because for now, many just think I'm telling an elaborate tale. My brother-in-law John and I left Winnipeg early April of 1995 to head to British Columbia to work for the summer. We decided that we would drive through the day and night on this 24-hour journey and take some stops along the way, even though it would make our trip more like a 36-hour journey. We had an uneventful first day, and my 1984 VW Golf was packed to the roof. I also had the rear seats folded down so we could fit even more of our gear. And we had this little hatchback packed to the roof, from just behind our heads in the front seat all the way to the back of the hatch. I share this as it will be pertinent later in the event. We left Lloydminster, Alberta at roughly 2:30, and we both had our second wind, so we drove rather than resting despite the late hour, and having been on the road over 12 hours now. We were traveling on Highway 16 West, which in Canada is known as the Yellowhead, and you have to understand that in these parts there are not a lot of people, and we would pass another car maybe every half hour at best. There is just not much going on in these parts in the day and almost nothing at night. To keep ourselves going, we had the windows rolled down for the cool night air and had some of our favorite tunes playing on my stereo and smoking a few cigars just to pass the time. I remember changing the song on the stereo and glancing that it was now 3:45. It would be at least another hour and 45 minutes to Edmonton, Alberta. And what happened next, I can only describe as if my life was like an old reel of film that someone cut 7 hours of time out of and spliced it together again. Because in a flash, 7 hours of time that we would not have otherwise known went missing, except for that it was now clear daylight and we were not on the highway. I was now in the hatch of my car, with my body pressed into the roof, laying on my back, upside down, and looking backwards out of the hatch, with my face pressed into the glass. I called for John again and again to help me as I was stuck. I would later learn that he himself was upside down with his legs where his head should be, and his upper body in the footwell, with his head wedged behind the floor center console area. I kept calling him to come help me and open the hatch, as there was no way I could get out otherwise. I was pressed in there in a way that defied any logic, as that car was packed to the point that we had to use our weight to close the hatch. Eventually, John got to the back of the car and helped me out. We were both dead silent for several minutes and only shared some crazy, scared, wild-eyed glances at each other. I offered him a cigarette, and we sat in what we now realize was a field of mature wheat with no highway in sight. I glanced at the time, and it was currently 10:30, with the sun shining bright. Finally, after finishing a cigarette, I said to John, "I don't know what just happened, but I want you to take a piece of paper, and we are both going to write down what we can recall since we left the most recent gas station in Lloydminster." After doing so, we compared notes and shared exactly what I shared with you all. We then looked around and saw a gravel road not too far away, perhaps a few hundred feet. The soil was bone dry, so I could make my way out with my VW Golf, and in doing so, it dawned on me that we were running mature wheat as we drove out, but astonishingly had not made any visible paths. My car ended up in the spot that it did. And with this, I started to shake. And when John looked over at me and saw me shaking, he saw what I was seeing and started to cry. It sank in that we had lost 7 hours of our lives, and they vanished in less than a second, and went from night to day. I followed the gravel road, and it led me back to the Highway 16. And for a moment, I thought, okay, I just went off the highway and passed out. Except for that, we checked the road signs and realized that we were now back east about 15 kilometers, or 9 miles, from where we last remembered being. To explain more clearly, we were traveling in the same spot we were driving on the last 10 minutes before we went blank. Now more freaked out than ever, I pulled over because my foot shook too much to drive and hold a steady throttle. And I looked over the car. There was not a spot of damage to the car. We were not hurt or disturbed in any way that we could tell, and our car was 9 miles backwards from where we left off, in the middle of a wheat field with no tracks leading in, and 7 hours of life vanished. When we arrived in Prince George, British Columbia, we checked into the medical clinic, as I feared I had some mental episode, or we had our drink spiked or something, but both John and I checked out okay and cleared the required toxicology screening for our employment. John and I have run into each other occasionally over the past 24 years, and we both recall the same details to this day. I have no idea what happened to me and John, and in being brave enough to share a few times, we have only faced ridicule. I'm not prepared to say that I was abducted by something, but I also know that what occurred was not just me and John falling asleep in the car. I just really don't know what occurred that night 24 years ago. I realize that this does not fall into a typical paranormal story, nor does it fall into a UFO story, as we didn't see a flying saucer or any weird lights in the sky. We simply lost 7 hours of life in the blink of an eye, and were reversed 9 miles into a wheat field that was undisturbed by my VW Golf.